Hi everybody, good afternoon and thank you so much for joining us. As the title suggests, the purpose of the next 45 minutes or so is to provide some suggestions and maybe spark some debate on how best to increase donations at your fundraising events in a cost-effective way. I'm sure you'll all agree that keeping event formats fresh, fundraising totals high and event costs low is a common goal for fundraisers across the country and beyond. My name is John Roberts. I'm Director of Business Development at Givergy, and joining us today we have Harry Santarolaya, MC and fundraising consultant based out of New York City but with extensive experience here in the UK. Say hello, Harry.
Morning everyone from the land of the free.
How are you getting on over there?
Yeah, no, good. It's shaping up to be another beautiful day in New York City. I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Fantastic. Well, look, first things first, as we are live today, please feel free to tweet in with any thoughts, comments, or suggestions at any point. We're at Givergy UK using the hashtag #RaisingMore. There's also a chat function, which I believe is the bottom right of your screen. Should you wish to send us a quick message or question directly, please feel free to do so, although there is an actual Q&A section towards the end. So if you'd like to save it till then, feel free to do that also. We're also recording today's session for your information, for anyone who hasn't been able to make the 12 o'clock slot. So on the agenda for today, first things first, what makes a good MC? A fairly fundamental question and one which we hope to answer for your reference going forward. Tips to communicate your goal effectively. How to create a competitive environment at your event and how to engage the silent majority. Now, I recognize quite a few names on today's webinar, so welcome. But for those on the call who maybe aren't quite so familiar with Givergy and what we do, here's a bit of context for you. Givergy are a fundraising technology company headquartered in London with offices in the US, Canada, Hong Kong, and Australia. Over the past 12 months, we've raised in excess of 45 million for our charity clients. We've supported over 1,500 events globally for over 1,200 incredible causes. And we thought we might open with a quick straw poll just to see how pledge drives and pledge moments are currently used within the UK. Now, by means of a quick definition, consider a pledge drive as any specific section of your running order which is dedicated to a fundraising pledge or donation moment driven by an MC from the stage. Sometimes they're known as pledge moments, sometimes in the US it's fund a need, but for the purpose of this webinar, let's go with pledge drive. You should shortly have a quick box pop up, and if you could indicate yes, no, or unsure as to whether you've operated pledge drives in the past or whether you operate them at the moment, that would be great. We'll give you a couple of seconds to get those in and have a look at the scores. Okay, so 42% of you have indicated that yes, a pledge drive is something that you use at the moment or have done in the past. So I'll be interested to see whether by the end of this quick webinar that's changed at all, and if it has, hopefully it's moved towards yes. So I'm going to hand over to Harry in a second. He's going to lead the middle section of this webinar. And Harry, I believe, is going to start on the importance of doing your research and getting to know your audience and your demographic before the event begins. So Harry, would you like to take the reins?
Sure, and that was quite an interesting stat actually, that it was just under 50% don't actually have a direct ask throughout the event. It's interesting for me because I started off in this industry over in the UK with Givergy full-time back in 2012, and then sort of moved over to New York about 3 years ago, and without question that figure would be closer to 90% here in the US, where they have a sort of specific targeted drive where they are essentially reaching out to the audience and saying, you know, now's your time to participate, and there are various ways in which to get involved with the fundraising efforts this evening, live auctions, silent auctions, raffles, heads and tails, that sort of thing. But invariably they always have an appeal, an ask, a moment where there's sort of an engaging sort of between 7 and 12 minute drive. And just like anything, the more research that you do and the more prepared you are going into your fundraising event and breaking down your fundraising narrative to work out what's going to appeal to your audience, the better. I mean, it really is, you know, that old cliche that my dad always says, if you fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And, you know, fundraising is exactly the same. So when we're talking about doing your research, what I'm typically focused on when I work with a new client is trying to collate as much information as humanly possible about previous events. That includes guest demographic. So what is your event, you know, your event audience compiled by? What are we looking at? When an MC is looking out to an audience, are we looking at a corporate heavy event, an event where typically, you know, 80% of the audience are there, part of, you know, sponsored tables or corporate entertainment, that sort of thing? Are we looking at school events where 80% of the audience are there because they are, you know, friends and family or parents of people, you know, that are part of a school, so they're much more sort of personally involved with the event? It does make a huge difference really breaking down those guest demographics, because for me, one of the most important, you know, statistics to identify is what percentage of the audience has actually paid to be in the room. And this is something we're going to cover a little bit later on, but it's identifying, you know, what is the silent majority of your event, because typically 70%, 75% of all guest attendees haven't even paid to be in the room, which is, you know, that is the reality of fundraising. They are typically guests of very generous table hosts who have purchased a whole table and then invited 9 others to join them, or even better, from a fundraising perspective, it's a corporate table whereby everyone in the room, everyone on that table is actually there sort of on the company's dime. So those are really, really key targets when you're talking about a pledge drive. And then I guess, you know, for me, once you've identified that guest demographic, you know, you can start utilizing past event data as well. And really identifying, you know, where in the fundraising narrative your most successful periods of fundraising have been. So, you know, for me, what I like to look at when it comes to sort of pledge moments and actually, to be fair, across the whole event, is what percentage of the audience, you know, whether or not they've paid to be there or not, and they've bought an individual ticket, or whether they've bought a table or whatever. Our goal as fundraisers, the night of an event, you know, the level of success should be measured by how many people participate that evening, how many people part with cash that evening, either in the live auction, the silent auction, the raffle, or indeed the pledge drive. And for me, the pledge drive is a perfect opportunity to sort of sweep up the rest of the audience in one way or another, to varying degrees, to try and stimulate some form of spend from everyone and anyone in the audience who hasn't either bought a ticket or participated in the live auction and so on. Because typically, let's be honest, live auctions, you know, it's a spectator sport. 95% of the audience can't even be involved in the live auction because, you know, they're simply priced out of the market, which is absolutely fine. And hopefully a good auctioneer is going to be driving those, you know, those bids up as high as possible. But in its very nature, only one person can win an item at a time, or sometimes 2. But they're typically at a very high price, which means 95% of the audience is just watching. So a quality MC or auctioneer will, you know, have to tread that line between keeping 95% of the audience entertained and engaged, whilst extracting as much money as possible from the 5% of the audience. Whereas for me, when it comes to a pledge drive, what we're looking to do is turn that spectator sport where people are watching individuals compete, we're trying to turn it into a moment and almost like a movement within the event, whereby everyone feels included, whether or not they're coming in at £25 just to say thank you to their table host for inviting them to that evening, or whether or not they're spending $25,000 because they've been a long-time patron of the organization. And that's where looking at that past event data is absolutely vital. Because I'd hazard a guess that the vast majority of those listening to this webinar now, if you really go through the stats of previous years, I think it'd be, I think you'd be amazed at how low the percentage of audience participation has been in the past. Or potentially a lot of you are sort of nodding your heads right now, agreeing with the fact that it's not ideal that there's so many people in the room essentially on a free ride. So our goal with a pledge drive is to turn it into a collectivism, turn it into a team event, not a spectator sport, a moment where everyone feels totally included, and you present the audience with a very clear, very fair and reasonable target to achieve with a certain period of time, and collectively as a room you try and achieve that goal. And then for me, one of the most important points looking at that past event data is to break your audience into two categories. You've got the first category is what I call an emotional pledge. So these typically people who have been part of the organization for a while. They have a long history with it. They may have purchased a table. They may have some personal reason why they've been a part of it. They are, more often than not, they're going to be spending much larger sums of money during a pledge drive. They're going to be contributing at a much higher level, which is fantastic. But the bottom line is they're not a particularly tough sell because they're already bought into the organization and helping fund it. What Givergy is absolutely incredible at doing is capitalizing on the other 80% of the audience, that sort of silent majority that typically will come to your event, indulge in the food and the wine and everything, and leave having actually spent nothing. That 80% are what I call transactional pledges. So they may just be sort of guests of that evening. They might have even been invited that morning. There's a strong chance a lot of them are interns that were given a ticket by their boss because their boss couldn't make it that night. The bottom line is it doesn't matter. It does not matter why they're in the room or how they got into the room or who invited them. There should be no one that leaves your fundraising event having learned about your organization's campaign, where the money's going, and the amazing work you're doing. There's no one who should be leaving having spent nothing. And so that's where the Givergy platform is absolutely incredible, because it opens up the door to making that whole pledge drive and that moment of huge audience participation fun and engaging. And no matter what level you're coming in at, you feel a part of that whole process, and you get to feel a part of that sort of that feel-good feeling at the end of the evening when you've hit the goal, whether or not you've come in at 25 grand or 25 pounds. You've contributed to it, and that's one of the best aspects of the Givergy system, is it's so malleable, and we'll talk about all the ways in which you can structure the system to really target that audience.
I can just say, Harry, I've witnessed numerous events now where they've gone from, as you've described, by having a relatively small percentage of people pledge and get involved in previous years, and seeing them be challenged by an MC from the stage, not to necessarily hit a specific target, but just to see 100% engagement in the room. And you can kind of see people sat there buying into the idea of it. And as soon as they understand that they don't have to be giving, £50,000 in order to qualify for this, it's simply a case of giving something. As soon as you see them buy into that idea and you see that percentage totalizer increase to the point where it's quite clear that only a little nudge further will get them to 100%, it's quite amazing. And it's certainly something that I think is applicable on both sides of the pond. It's a really interesting point to hear.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, I think maybe a nice point to move on to now, following that from Harry, is actually looking into what does make a good MC. I know that when I sit down with clients and run through a bit of a consultation process ahead of their events, where we figure out exactly what fundraising streams they're using, what could they tweak, what could they add in, who's responsible for each section of that fundraising. One of the questions we often get asked relating to the idea of a pledge drive is who should lead it. Often charities will be very fortunate in that they'll have somebody close to the charity who actually volunteers to go up on the stage and run that for them, which is obviously great and very generous. But I guess there are pros and cons when comparing that with somebody who maybe does it as a profession and is, wildly experienced in it and knows exactly what to do to push the buttons of the audience to get out from them exactly what the charity wants. So Harry, in your opinion, what does make a good MC? What kind of qualities should fundraisers be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of the age-old battle that I've had when it comes to strategizing for your fundraising campaign. A lot of times, the big mistake is, as you say, to employ, an entertainer or a celebrity or a face or someone who is, of course, trained and well versed at public speaking, but they're not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean that they fully understand the dynamic of fundraising and the importance of really engaging an audience from a fundraising perspective. And so for me, when we're talking about the strengths and weaknesses of MCs, obviously being able to hold an audience's attention is one thing, and it's always great when board members feel they put their hands up to help out and save costs, and you don't need to invest in an MC. I've done the annual speech at our company's event, for the last 7 years. I've got this covered. Unfortunately, that can usually be very costly to the actual fundraising event, because the bottom line is whether or not they're a celebrity or a performer or an entertainer or even just someone who's good at public speaking, their focus might not necessarily be from a fundraising perspective. Especially when you're up there, speaking from experience here, if you are, maybe having a slow start to the pledge drive, you typically will what you don't want to be doing is panicking and going blindly into just trying to entertain the audience and make them laugh, which is, that's more or less the role of what entertainers do on a daily basis. But there's a huge difference between being an entertainer and being a fundraiser. And for me, the most successful events certainly I've been a part of and that I've seen executed on both sides of the pond have recognized the massive difference between the two. And this weekend was actually a really good example of that. I was fortunate enough to be driving the pledge and the live auction for the Philly Fights Cancer event. We had been meticulously through their data for the last two months. There's an audience of about 1,500 guests, so typically that means about 800 potential pledges when you take into account that a lot of couples pledge together. And they had large budgets, so obviously the figures are all relative, but Whoopi Goldberg was hosting the event, John Legend was headlining the event, but I was doing the fundraising. And yes, I would never ever be able to, well, there's a very limited chance I will ever be in the same category as either Whoopi Goldberg or John Legend when it comes to an entertainment.
Don't sell yourself short, Harry.
Oh, come on, John. You're making me blush. But no, of course, I'll never, I couldn't possibly hope to be in that same bracket from an entertainment perspective. You're looking at two of the greatest, living performers at the moment. Whoopi Goldberg's, I realized, is actually one of the only EGOTs. She's got the Emmy, Grammy, Tony, and Oscar. But the bottom line is the client recognized that it's all well and good getting these two incredible performers on, and of course the audience will be thrilled to have them there, and it adds massive amounts of value to the content of the event. But they invested in a fundraising professional for the actual drive and for the live auction, and the results spoke for themselves. Utilizing the Givergy system, and building a platform that I knew would work well for their audience. We went from 150 pledges last year and $900,000 raised to just over 700 pledges this year and $2.1 million raised. So that was, and you know, we're not talking about a massively different audience. In terms of entertainment, the year before they had Lionel Richie, and you know, there was all just as strong an event. The only difference is we meticulously planned how we were going to execute a fundraising strategy. They left the fundraising drive and the pledge moment and the live auction to me, and working with their team, I built a Givergy system I knew that would work very well with them, which included a very clear target with totalizers. We challenged the audience, looking for audience participation. We presented what percentage of the audience had given. And then one of my favorite aspects, and this is something we're going to talk about later on, is how many pledges were made per table. And we challenged the room to get as much participation as humanly possible, and made it fun and engaging. And that is what it's all about when it comes to a strong delivery from an MC. The bottom line is it needs to be fun, it needs to be engaging, it needs to remain tasteful, but it has to feel all-inclusive. And you know, I'm pleased to say it was a huge success, just based purely on the fact of previous experience of just planning and analyzing those stats and building a system that worked really well. And Givergy, as always, delivered.
I think that's a perfect example, Harry, of obviously how, you know, employing a professional fundraiser clearly pays absolute dividends from the point of view of the charity. I guess from my side here, it's certainly worth covering off as well and acknowledging that there are certainly going to be charities out there in their absolute infancy, hosting much smaller events that, even with the best will in the world, may not quite be at the stage where they can actually invest in a professional MC at this point. You know, I think it's a good point to make that where you do have somebody who's getting up on stage, maybe as doing it through goodwill, somebody close to the charity, at the very least, they need to be fully briefed in the Givergy system or whatever system you might be using on the night. It will help so much for when they get up on that stage and stand in front of your audience, if they're actually familiar with what they're going to be seeing, what guests are going to be using, and the information that's going to be displayed on the screens. The last thing you want is somebody getting up there for the first time and not knowing how that system works. So, as I said, whether it's us or whoever you might be using, I always strongly recommend that we have an actual call or a face-to-face meeting with your MC, your host, your fundraiser up on the stage, so that we can talk through some ideas around best practice, which will just mean they get up on that stage with as much confidence as they possibly can do.
Completely agree. Completely agree. And one of the, you know, small sort of tips I would give is to allow them to familiarize themselves with the system, you know, prior to the event and, you know, sort of half an hour before the event. But one of the biggest traps, especially when people are utilizing Givergy, is they try, very often they'll take a tablet up on stage and try and make a pledge live. And that almost always goes wrong, because you start to panic when you're entering in your guest information or your contact information. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is hold up the tablet, make it clear to everyone there's 2 or 3 on each tables, get the audience to wave them, and you know, basically just encourage each other to start sharing the tablets. And that kind of leads us on to that next point of how can the MC encourage donations. And again, for me, the most important thing is to make sure your audience is having fun. Make sure that they're actually engaged, that they feel part of the fundraising efforts of the evening. Because like I said, the vast majority of people in the room, the vast majority are you're targeting as transactional pledges. You have an 8-minute, 10-minute period where you can extract some funds from them. Otherwise, you've lost an opportunity. You've lost a potential revenue stream. So just like, you know, all businesses, you've got to see your event as a micro business. You know, your charity is a business. Your event is a micro business. You have your fixed costs. You have your variable costs. Your venue. You have, you know, variable costs of, you know, the flowers, the security, the food, all of these various things. And then you have your revenue streams of your ticket sales, your sponsorship, and all the rest of it. But as a collective, you have a huge amount of opportunity of revenue from all of the people in the room, and you're missing out on those opportunities if you're not capitalizing on that 8-minute transactional pledge drive. So some of these guests may not even visit your website the next day. That is the reality of fundraising. You have to identify this as a business. You have to remove the emotional side of this role and remove your own personal connections to the charity, and identify and accept the fact that a lot of the people in the audience may or may not be that, they may be very tenuously linked to the organization. They may or may not even follow up with your marketing and how the money's being spent and all that sort of thing. You have to just identify and accept that a lot of them, you have a very limited period of time to try and get something out of them, and the role of the MC is to make sure that they do that. And the best way to do that, in my experience, is to relate to the audience as a third party. So not necessarily coming from a begging perspective. You're not part of the organization. That's the other added benefit of employing the services of someone who's not part of the organization. You're coming from the same angle as the guest. You're saying, look, it doesn't matter why you're here. It doesn't matter, how long you've been part of the organization. You may have been invited this morning. It's your duty to part with something to say thank you. So if, like me, you are a guest this evening, now's your time to show your appreciation and to get involved. Another nice little practice that I like to do, especially with the Givergy premium tablet solution, is to get the audience to actually start sharing the tablet. So, get them to make their pledge, but then to turn to their left or to their right and teach the person, next to them how to give as well. So it's like a bit of a bonding experience. You get the whole table on side, and it's just much more inclusive.
Harry, I think an interesting point you make there as well, and certainly something that I talk through with fundraisers when we meet here in the UK, is if there's one reservation when it comes to a pledge, it's very often that I think people are maybe slightly reluctant to actually make that ask and have someone stood up there asking guests. I don't know whether it's maybe a slight fear of awkwardness should it not go the way they want, but something that I've noticed, having attended an awful lot of these events, is someone up on stage can actually get away with a huge amount, I think certainly far more than people might expect, simply because they ask the question in the right way. It's how you position it as opposed, as much as anything, to what you're actually saying. Do you find that sort of the use of humor and tone and all that kind of thing really makes a big impact in how people respond to that ask? Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think one of the, for me, having spent 4 years in the industry in the UK, or three and a half years in the industry in the UK, and then now just over 3 years here in the US, is such a stark difference between the way in which people fundraise over here. And I just wish, I absolutely wish that the UK fundraising sort of narrative was one that people were just they go into the event with a level of expectation that they are going to be parting ways with some cash, and it has to be led by the organization. There is so much money left on the table at a lot of the events in the UK that both we support at Givergy and various other events I've been to, simply because we haven't asked anything of the audience. That's part of the reason I got into what I do now on stage. It's having been to hundreds of gala dinners and recognize that very often either an organization is not asking in the right way, and as you said, John, lacing it with some humor and keeping it fun and engaging and inclusive, and making sure that you're not being too pushy, keeping it tasteful, or simply not even asking at all, which in my opinion, we're professional fundraisers. That is what we need to be doing. We need to be we have to have some level of expectation from our audience that they are going to buy into the idea that they need to part with some cash. And in my experience, it's not, pledge drives haven't been utilized or successful, not because people aren't in a position to give £25, £50, £100 to say thank you for the evening. It's not that they're not able to, or they're not willing and able to. It's It's just they've never been asked to. The worst, there's one thing I cannot stand is when I head into an event and I see pledge cards on the table, as if someone's just, you might get 2 or 3 in an evening, as if someone's just going to write down their details and just leave them on there, and and that's not inclusive. That doesn't inspire a young professional at the back of the room who, he's in the nosebleed seats and doesn't feel that engaged with the fundraising efforts. Why would I leave £50? As a part of my dispensable income as a young professional, that's too high for me to just leave on the table and not feel part of the process. The beauty of the Givergy system is having it broadcast up on the screens and making sure that when people's names are flashing out, they feel part of the process. So it's not that people aren't willing and able to give and can't give £25 or £50. That's a cheap night in London. The problem is they haven't been asked. And I would absolutely, almost guarantee that if you didn't have a pledge drive last year and you even just challenged the audience to, 10, 15, 20 grand in 5 minutes, with an event of 300 plus, you will hit it in minutes. And I think you'll be staggered by the level of audience participation once you actually just commit to a little pledge drive in your run of show. You present the audience with how to use the system, and then you let the system take over. I think you'll be staggered by the results.
I actually saw, I was at an event very recently, Harry, where I think it links very nicely to the point you've just made, whereby, how can you actually relate to everyone in your room? And it was particularly quite a corporate event. There were a lot of people in the room, as you described earlier, that probably hadn't actually paid to be there. They were guests of table hosts, and in all likelihood, they'd probably been ferried to and from the event as well. And the host who was up on the stage simply made the point by saying, I know a lot of you in the room are having a free night at the moment. I'm sure you'll all agree it's a fantastic event. All I would ask that now, during this pledge moment, you give whatever you feel you would have spent on a night out in London tonight. And you know what a night out in London costs? It can be anything from £50 to £100, somewhere around that region. And you just saw it start to click in people's heads. They actually, for the first time in the whole evening, sat there and thought, it's a very good point, actually. This is a fantastic event. I have spent quite literally nothing to be here. Even if I give half what I would have spent on a night out in London, at least I feel I've given something to the cause. So it's about making it relatable and applicable to the people that you've got sat in front of you, which links all the way back to your initial points and throughout, which is knowing your audience. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And then you have the added benefit of those who are leaving the event from your audience at the end of the night, who have traditionally and typically left having spent nothing and felt, to be fair, not as engaged from a fundraising perspective. You all of a sudden have a whole new group of people leaving, feeling motivated and feeling like they've been part of something, feeling like they've done something of note that evening and contributed to hitting a goal. And then you actually, I did mention that a lot of these people are sort of transactional pledges and not necessarily emotionally bought into the organization going into the night. But if you have committed to giving a bit of money, you are far more likely to pay attention to any marketing that's going to come in the following weeks, months, and years if you've engaged even at a low £50 level. And obviously that's one of the best strengths of the Givergy system is how quickly it captures all of that guest information if you haven't already got it. So lots to think about there.
I know, Harry, that you've talked about the importance of relaying data from the MC to the audience, maintaining engagement, keeping that bouncing along throughout. But maybe just a really quick point on the importance of maintaining that almost clear line of sight between event organizer and MC. Obviously, for the information to get from MC to audience, it has to have first got to the MC. So any thoughts on how best to make sure that's as painless a process as possible?
Yeah, I guess, again, this all links back to planning and preparation early on in the night. Early on prior to the event. If you've recognized early on, that's one of the things I sit down with my clients and try and recognize when it comes to demographic is, how hard can I push? What sort of an audience is this? Is this, I've got back-to-back events coming up on Thursday and Friday. One is a very, very conservative crowd, a much older crowd, At the Metropolitan Club, the average age is going to, probably 60 plus, and the push it's not going to be, too aggressive. It won't be sort of too, entertaining and flamboyant, and then it's just going to be a much more sort of tasteful ask that's going to be incrementally driven. And then the next night is a young professionals group over in Brooklyn, with 400 rowdy young professionals who are going to need, caroling and gripping. And so, one of the important points, prior to the event and working with the client on this, is getting information from them about what's going to work well, what's going to appeal to that particular audience. And so we know that depending on how the fundraising is going, how hard you can push throughout the night. So when I'm being fed data throughout the evening, if I'm being told, right, only 26% of the audience have got involved, if it's that young audience, the first thing I would do is probably get up on stage and say, right, 26% of you have given, which is amazing, but that means 84% of you still haven't. So can we all just raise a beer if we have actually made a donation now? Or raise your drink and get them up there and cheers each other. And I'm going to do another toast in 45 minutes, and I want everyone to be involved. It's like, that sort of simple stuff will make a big difference. But being able to get that information raw from the Givergy system in the back end it's absolutely invaluable. So being fed information is great. And then the next slide, where we're talking about displaying goals to the guests and challenging them, we've touched on it already. But, again, it's really, really simple. For me, I like to have audience participation levels displayed. I like to know if it's a sat-down gala dinner with tables of 10. I like to have leaderboards of the most active tables. I know that that's not necessarily going, that might scare, a few committees, so you don't have to lead with that. But I personally see no harm in it, because Givergy can even broadcast how much has been raised per table, which is a really aggressive stance, and one that I've only utilized a few times, but it's typically a very, very corporate environment, and it's a lot of fun. It's usually kind of tables competing with each other financially. But for me, just having number of pledges per tables is an absolutely awesome way of broadcasting how active the room is, and then motivating the table to work together is absolutely key as well.
I know that obviously the core of this is cost effectiveness. It's how can sort of charities leverage the tools they have to the greatest effect. And I know that something which has worked particularly well, which is a fairly low cost option for charities, certainly when it comes to motivating tables to work together, is I've seen hosts sort of get up there on the stage and almost announce an ad hoc competition, so to speak. And even though that I think everyone knows sort of back of house that it's very much choreographed. But they'll announce something like, right guys, you seem to be doing fantastically well so far. As a bit of fun, I'm going to get back up on stage in 45 minutes. And the table that's made the most pledges in that time, we're going to send a bottle of champagne over to thank you so much for getting involved in the fundraising. Yep. And suddenly it just instills that, I guess, a collective consciousness, doesn't it? You've got whole tables looking at each other going, right, you place a bid, so you make a pledge, and you make a pledge, and we'll be at the top and in line for the champagne. Yeah. So do you find that much in your experience, that those little incentives, can they make a difference?
Yeah, I've seen that a number of times, and actually been part of drives where we've utilized that. Belvedere, we do a campaign with every single AmFAR event where anyone who spends over $500 is sent a customized Belvedere bottle, with their name inscribed on it, and which is always very effective. But then, you can even have it in really cost-effective ways. Very often you'll have drink sponsors, sponsoring events, or even if you just have to purchase the champagne itself, motivating them with, the fastest table to get 100% participation receives a magnum of champagne is a really nice way of doing it. And setting the Givergy system so that the minimum donation is £25, £25, that if there's 100% participation, you've got at least £250 from each table. But that's a very modest estimate because a lot of people are going to give more than £25. So yeah, that works really, really well. I love seeing that as well.
Great. I think a final point just to make on, I guess, motivating tables and I guess relaying that information from the stage. There is still, believe it or not, the odd client I'll have out in the UK who will say sort of, should we still be pointing out and putting a spotlight on the tables that aren't donating? I mean, from my side of things, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you disagree, all of this is about positive spin. It's about championing the tables or the individuals that are getting involved and are engaged, I guess, heroing them and making them an aspirational point for everyone else in the room. Everything should be kept positive, kept bouncing along, always steer clear of anything that could be perceived as negative. Is that something that you'd agree on?
Yeah, I would actually. I would. And actually, one of the most important points from the organizations, so many people who are going to be listening to this and watching this presentation, from the organization's perspective, your role, having employed the services of someone who's a professional fundraiser and is working closely with you to try and target that mass participation. Your role from the fundraising event organization's perspective is to communicate a clear message about where the money is going and so on, which is something we're going to touch on very shortly. But keeping that positive message and really relaying how the money has been spent in the past and why it's been so effective and why it's so important to get as much involvement as possible. That's really the organization's role. And then the MC's role is to really drive home this message of, right, we now all need to do our bit. And that includes engaging that silent majority I talked about, who have typically in the past crept into your event, enjoyed a nice bottle of red wine and a fillet steak and sort of sat back, caught up with friends and left having spent nothing. So engaging that silent majority, which we've already sort of touched on already, is absolutely vital. Increasing that participation level is key, because once you've got that momentum, and there comes what I call a tipping point in fundraising at these events, where once you have a certain percentage of the audience, once a decent chunk, around 35% of the audience, has actively got involved with the pledge drive, whether it's £25 or £2,000, once you've hit that certain level, there becomes a level of expectation placed on those who haven't given. And that is a massive, massive bonus for the MC, because once you become part of the minority who haven't given, you are far more likely to give in the remaining hour or so left of the night. And that's again another, this again linking back to Saturday night's event. It was all planned. It's very, very strategic. We knew we were going to get large chunks of money from the big spenders in the room. We knew that. What we didn't know is how many out of the other sort of 700, 800 couples were going to be able to give. And part of my strategy with the client was to utilize, Whoopi Goldberg's celebrity at the very end of the drive. Once we had got the large chunks of cash in, we had the client made these foam hands, these boxing gloves, under every single seat, and we revealed that to the audience towards the end of the drive. And I got Whoopi back up on stage, and I said, right, I'm taking a selfie with Whoopi and all 2,000 of you in the background. If you've made a pledge, you can put your hand up with the foam hand on. Or if you're going to make a pledge, in the next 5 or 10 minutes, you can also get involved. And sure enough, everyone had their hands up, for the picture, and it turned into a bit of a social media push. And then, if you watch the stats after I got off stage and we'd done that final push, you saw hundreds more flood in, because once they had actually put their hand up, they felt compelled to give. They can't not give, having engaged in that moment. So it was just strategic planning. It looked very, very sort of ad hoc and sort of spontaneous, but it was all planned.
And it's quite interesting as well to see how it can, how the narrative progresses from maybe at the very beginning of the event, somebody thinking, oh, at some point I'm going to have to pledge, right through to the other end, as you've just described, where suddenly you've got a room of 2,000 people, and those that haven't given are getting a fear of missing out. They actually now feel that they need to do so. They really want to get involved just so they can get in on the action.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we've kind of already touched on this point of communicating how donations are made, and sorry, how they make a difference. That was the point I just made, is that's the organization's role, that's the CEO's role, or whoever is going to be the lead point of the event from the organization's perspective. Whether it's Prince Charles getting up there for the Prince's Trust, or the headmaster getting up at the local prep school. That's the message that comes from that lead figure. That's not the fundraising push. That's the message, and the message is very clear. It should be about how the donations are being spent. Give people quantifiable results. Driven stats. Last year we raised £800,000, and with that money we did X, Y, and Z. This year we're looking for $1 million, and with it, bum, bum, bum. And then leave the fundraising to the professional who is going to be from a third party and can relate to the audience. But it's such a key, such a key point. And I think when you come from both angles and both the message is clear from the organization and the MC's on point, it leads to some pretty great results. And that's just a little quote, which is more or less summing up everything we've just talked about, John.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. I guess there's a little takeaway soundbite from this. I think it's quite well put together. But the silent majority are the 70% that show up as mere seat fillers for the corporate tables to enjoy the fruits of your labours. It's not that these people aren't willing to give. You just need to engage them to do so. And that's the absolute key from my perspective. It's just about giving them the motivation and engagement to do so.
John, if I go before you, I'd like that engraved on my gravestone, please. Can you have that chiseled in?
I'll start doing it now. No worries. Well, look, guys, we're approaching the end, and hopefully you found the last 45 minutes or so useful and interesting. I'm sure we'll find out if not, and either way. But it might be quite nice just to have a re-straw poll, if that's a thing. I might have just coined something there. Poll is now open. I'd love to hear whether your thoughts or opinions have changed in any way. Hopefully they've changed towards the positive. But just take a couple of seconds now to answer the question again. Would you now consider implementing a strategic pledge drive? And we'll then have a quick look at the results.
Will also determine whether or not people are still awake. I'm hoping that I'm hoping they are.
Believe it or not, this is going to sound like I've made this up, but we're actually now on 100% who've said they would now at least consider implementing a strategic. I almost wish it was like 96, but that's fantastic. Hopefully that means at least something's come across today and provided a bit of food for thought.
See, John,
just to finish,
you see 100%. I personally see an opportunity, and I think that opportunity is for those who did engage with that poll, maybe reaching out to John Roberts and seeing whether or not he is available to get up and lead your pledge drive. Now, I'm just floating it out there. I think there's an opportunity there for a strong MC, and in that first slide, you got to see how dashing he is as well. So I'm going to pick up the phone to him. You're welcome.
Right, guys, well, as promised at the start, opportunity for a quick Q&A. If anybody does have some questions to come our way, now's the time to send them over. Okay, we've actually got one come through already. This is probably actually more applicable for Harry. Do you feel that fundraising trends in the US tend to migrate across the pond?
It depends on from what angle. I mean, funnily enough, it's actually the US fundraising dynamic it's sort of a much more sort of aggressive approach, as I mentioned earlier. That it's a bit more of a it's almost like the equivalent of a transactional pledge. People know what they're there to do. and it's kind of quick, it's snappy. They're in, they spend their money and they're out. But I think that's because the industry as a whole has actually, you know, bred this this understanding that, you know, if you're invited to these events and you haven't bought a ticket, or whether or not you have bought tickets, if you're coming, you're spending a bit of money in one way or another, whether it's a silent auction or whether it's a you know, the pledge drive. But what is interesting is that there's a very high percentage of Brits in the US who are utilized for the actual fundraising itself, and I don't know whether or not that's because they sort of buy into the accent or something, but very often I have clients ask what, you know, what are they doing in London that's most effective, and you know, for me, if I'm honest, I actually find that the fundraising sort of mindset over here is certainly just from a fundraising perspective, maybe not from an event sort of audience participation, you know, event audience sort of enjoyment factor. I like the fact that they're very you know, get the fundraising done, and move on with, you know, a lot of people will use a gala dinner, for example, as the opening of their night, and then they continue their evening. So it's much faster. I don't think that happens in the UK as much.
And one final quick question, which is, how long do you think an MC would need on stage to drive donations? I think certainly from our side of the pond, we see it vary quite a bit. It can be anything from 10 minutes up to 25. I think from our side, and I'll hand over to Harry to finish off on that final point shortly, it really does depend on how well it's been planned out and what it actually includes. You know, if they're going to get up for 20 minutes and have no necessary plan in place, I'd probably suggest that's not a great idea. But if there is a plan, you know exactly how that's going to pan out over the course of that duration, then, you know, I wouldn't say that's too long. But from your side, Harry, what would you say is an average or suggestible time for someone up on stage?
I always say between 8 and 12 minutes in a run of show. I don't think you need any longer. And even if you're doing a soft ask where you're just essentially making it clear what the screens are there to do and what the tablets are there to do, and you're not doing an incremental drive where you're working down from a high amount down to a sort of, you know, lower and lower and lower amount, you actually, you know, it can even be sort of 5 to 6 minutes. But the most important point is, you know, everything stops and you focus on that pledge drive. You know, service is not happening. The band's not playing. You know, the screens are 100% focused on Givergy, and for that period of time, you are absolutely fixed on your goal. And again, as John mentioned, you know, it does vary event to event, and you've usually identified exactly, you know, what you're hoping to achieve by it. And for example, the Saturday night one went on, you know, a lot longer than 6 minutes. It lasted about 16 in total, which for a very small event would be far, far too long. But when you've got, I think, between 1,800 and 2,000 guests and 2 million to raise, we had strategized that it was going to take that long, and it was built into the run of show. So for me, don't panic. And don't worry if you're running over a few minutes in the run of show. That always happens. Every event planner will empathize with the fact that run of shows are always running slightly over. But your pledge drive is, in my opinion, arguably the most important aspect of the run of show, because it's money for nothing. You are selling nothing. You are managing no lot items. You are not, you know, you're not responsible for putting the money in people's pockets. All you're doing is making a direct ask and making it fun, making it engaging, and letting the Givergy system do what it does best, and that's just raise money.
Well, I think that's a fantastic point to finish on. So, well, thank you, Harry, but also most importantly, thank you everybody who's listened today. Hopefully you found that useful, and obviously, as ever, if you have any further questions off the back of these webinars that we host, then please do drop us a line, get in touch. We'll be happy to chat through anything with you, even if it's just ideas, questions, bouncing back and forth. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.